Okay, hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. We're very excited today to be talking with Robert Ovetz. Robert teaches university classes and has also written a few books, one of which is We the Elites, which talks about the U.S. Constitution. That came out in 2002, and that was actually how I first met Robert and was introduced to his work. But Robert, I'll start us off by letting you introduce yourself. What has your political journey been like? How did you become interested in the Constitution and democracy? What are you up to?
Yeah, so my book, just as a correction, my book was published in 2022. And my political journey has been a long one. When I uh, got to the University of Texas at Austin, I witnessed firsthand the end of the anti-apartheid movement on campus, and that really awakened me to the possibilities of reorganizing our society. And over the years, while I was a undergraduate and graduate student there, I was involved in a number of different movements, particularly against the first Persian Gulf War, and also attempting to organize a union for graduate students, where I last heard they're still working on that. Tried to unionize a co-op, a food co-op, and then went on to work for NGOs on international issues of debt and development and ocean conservation. And I started to realize, particularly after one campaign that I led resulted in changing international law at the United Nations, I realized that that model of advocacy and mobilizing and using the rules of the system to change the system was a dead end. And when I moved back to the United States from the Netherlands, where I lived for 6 years, I was working for NGOs, but I also began teaching, and I started writing again. And I found my way through teaching literally thousands of undergraduate students, introductory level courses on the US and California system of government and politics, and fundamentally teaching them about the Constitution. And I realized I've been doing this now for about 20 years, realized over the course of a number of years that there really wasn't one good critical analysis of our constitutional system of government that I could assign my students. There were a few great books that are now long out of print. For example, Katznelson and others, Politics of Power, and Michael Parenti's Democracy for the Few. But I found that they were limited in some ways and also not widely available or just too expensive. So I decided that I would put together my teachings into what became my third book, and my last individually authored book.
Well, connected to teaching, one of the things I like about your book and also other interviews I've heard you do is that you talk about what you do in the classroom. You integrate that into your work. And in the opening of your book, you write that students uh, tend to have a hard time putting a label on the U.S. political system, and you say that this is understandable. Um, and so I was curious why you think students struggle to define the political system we have, and then at the same time, perhaps why many people seem content to just call the US a democracy and sort of leave it at that. It's both difficult to define and yet so easy for people to seemingly just call it a democracy and leave it at that. Yeah.
Well, the origin of that really lies in my own upbringing. When I was in high school, I used to think that someday I wanted to be a U.S. senator. And like I tell my students now, when I grew up and started teaching political science, I realized I couldn't afford it. And I decided to teach political science instead after spending many years as a advocate, a lobbyist, and in recent years as a rank and file union organizer in my faculty union. And when I was growing up, I learned that we live in a representative democracy where the majority rules and we elect our representatives and they're beholden to us to make decisions. And that's the same story, if you will. I call it the origin story of our system that students still learn. They learn it on the news, they learn it from their parents and their history and civics teachers, they learn it from their textbooks, and they learn it from magazines and newspapers. But there's something fundamentally wrong with that, is that while we're told we have a system of democracy, virtually everybody realizes that it's not very democratic. You don't have to have taken a political science class to know that those who are making the decisions on our behalf are not acting in the interests of the supermajority. For example, polls consistently show that a supermajority of people asked want government to provide better public education, better and free higher education, to address our housing and healthcare crisis, to protect the environment and help workers unionize and increase pay. And yet we consistently never get any of that. And so there's a disconnect. And I think it's kind of inherent. It's almost common sense that our system is not what it claims to be. So at the beginning of every semester of my intro to US and California government and politics classes, and I teach full-time at San Jose State University in California, and I also teach part-time at one or other community colleges, I poll my students with a number of questions. And at the beginning of the semester or the quarter, and one of the questions is, which kind of system do we have? And I list 9 different possibilities: representative democracy, direct democracy, a republic, a democratic republic, a capitalist democracy, a plutocracy, and several other choices. And what's really stunning is every class, the students answer across the spectrum. Virtually every possible option is chosen by at least few students. There's no agreement on what exactly we have. And so I kind of lay out the course that what we're told we have and what we actually have is quite different. And here's why. And so we go through and we study the Constitution and we apply it to contemporary issues. Here's why things work or don't work. And here's what's missing. And what do we do about it? So I think the origins of that really show itself all the time. That many people know that voting is not enough to change anything, and yet we're told that voting matters. So those kinds of stories that we continue to tell ourselves about our system are still problematic.
Out of curiosity, have you noticed any changes in how your students talk about the questions of democracy, or how they answer that question? Sounds like there's still a mix.
Well, I think by the end of the course, a lot of the students have recognized that for the most part, we have elements of a representative democracy. In the state of California, we have elements of a direct democracy at what's called the Swiss system at the state and local level. But for the most part, we have a plutocracy. We have a system, the word comes from the Latin god for the underworld and the god of miners and wealth, Pluto. And I think many of my students by the end of the course recognize that there's a very strong element of plutocracy in our system. And so I think the evolution happens over the course, but I'm not sure that there's much change from one cohort of students to the next.
Something else that you integrate in your teaching, I believe you talked about this in a podcast around the time that your book came out. using the Green New Deal as an example for how our political system works. I think you might refer to it as the legislative meat grinder or something like that. But the Green New Deal, I think, still has some purchase within sections of the left, center politics, um, that can kind of still be realized. Generally, the idea that big transformative legislative change could be realized. I personally think that that's a really steep hill to climb, and I think the Green New Deal is a good example of that. So, how do you use the Green New Deal, and then also what does the Green New Deal have to teach us?
So the Green New Deal, I think, in some ways, is what we could call a social democratic vision for how we can reform our system of capitalist democracy by rewiring our economic system, supposedly to make it, air quotes, more sustainable so that we can slow, maybe even eventually reverse a lot of the damage from climate catastrophe. And basically, for those who don't know what the Green New Deal is, it's basically the idea that the state will intervene in the economy and provide a combination of regulations, subsidies, and outright prohibitions on the burning, on the extraction, the transport, and the burning and use of fossil fuels. And will use Keynesian policy to redirect the capitalist economy towards green energy, green tech, and so forth, while also training millions of people to go through what's sometimes referred to as the just transition that comes from Tony Mazzocchi, the famous labor organizer, which is now, his term has gone global. I hear it used in countries around the world. Just transition so that those workers who are in those fields that rely on fossil fuels can be retrained, provided an income and their education covered so that they can learn new skills and new trades. It's a big package of legislation that's never actually been fully written. While the Green New Deal has been introduced into Congress, if you look closely, the bill just lays out whereases. It doesn't really have any of the details. So the story of the Green New Deal is something that I give in my classes, and like you said, I talk about it in the book as an illustration of the way that our system was designed around what we learn as checks and balances and separation of powers. These are two elementary terms that you can learn from a Schoolhouse Rock video on I'm Just a Bill, for example. And this is part of the mythology of our system, the idea that the framers designed our system by separating out the powers across the three branches. Articles 1, legislative branch; Article 2, the executive; Article 3, the judicial branch, and then separating the powers between the federal government and the states. So combined, those powers are separated across the three branches and between the federal and the state government. And by separating those powers, it requires that at least one other branch go along with what a branch wants to do. The judicial branch was written with almost no checks over the other branches, and that was invented early on as judicial review by the second Chief Justice, John Marshall. However, our system doesn't work that way. The framers didn't separate the powers and create checks and balances to prevent a new king or a dictator from emerging. In fact, depending on the outcome of the election in a few days, I don't know when this podcast will come out, but in a few days, we could very well reelect a president who overtly says that he wants to be a fascist dictator. And in that case, whatever remnants of our system of checks and balances and separation of powers that may exist will be swept away, most likely by a fascist in power. But nevertheless, the story we're told is the framers created the system to prevent power from being concentrated. But excuse me, as I discussed throughout my book, is that in fact what that system of checks and balances does is it creates a huge number of minority checks by which those who are in the minority who don't want change have numerous opportunities to block the forward progress of a new piece of legislation, not only in its passage through one in both houses, but even getting the president's signature rather than a veto, and then later in the courts from being challenged as unconstitutional, and then by the states refusing to go along or suing the federal government, claiming that this new law is unconstitutional, or even the federal government itself, the Congress failing to pass funding so that the bill can go into effect. At each step of the way, those who are in the minority have numerous opportunities to block the bill. Those who want change have to win every time. And in the process of trying to win every time, our system forces those who want change to compromise. In order to remove the possibilities of opposition, they have to open up the legislation to those who are opposed to it and say, okay, well, to get you either to be neutral or support the bill, what changes do you want? And through the process, a bill begins to transform itself so it doesn't look anything after it passes like it did at the beginning of the process. Now, this all sounds familiar, right? Because we hear all the time that the only way our system works is through compromise. And compromise is that code word that essentially says if you want change, you have to give something up to those who are opposed to that change, even if they're in the minority. Because even a small minority can block a bill, say in a committee or in a subcommittee. And even if the entire Senate votes for it, all 100 members, if a subcommittee in the House votes no, or it never gets out of the Rules Committee, then that bill's dead. And so I use the Green New Deal as an example of how the Green New Deal began and several years later passed as this unrecognizable bill called the Inflation Reduction Act, which we're hearing a lot about right now because it's the cornerstone piece of legislation of the Biden administration, and Vice President Harris is running on that record. So the Green New Deal, rather than doing all the things I talked about, was stripped down and introduced soon after President Biden came into office. And it became known as the Build Back Better bill. It was about $1.5 trillion bill that had some interesting elements: child subsidies, free higher education, community colleges, paid family and sick leave. It had training for workers to go through a just transition. It had subsidies for companies to transition to green energy. It didn't have any outright ban on the production, extraction, transportation, and burning of fossil fuels, but the idea was that it was going to start that transition. Well, that bill passed the House. But when it got to the Senate, it got held up by two senators who were actually Democrats. And those two Democrats held out and blocked Build Back Better until they got their pet projects. One of them actually owned coal mines. He's a retiring senator by the name of Manchin. And the other one is a senator from Arizona named Sinema, who wanted a tax cut for the financial sector. So the bill was essentially dead in the Senate. The Biden administration cut deals with these two senators, renamed the bill, stripped it down to less than half its size, and transformed it all into essentially tax cuts for companies that adopt green tech, and some tax incentives for companies to shift production of batteries for EVs to the United States, and a few other minor changes. And it passes the Inflation Reduction Act. So what begins as this forward-thinking restructuring and rewiring of our capitalist economy becomes a series of tax expenditures and tax cuts with no benefits at all directly to people. Now, I know that's a bit of a long recounting of this whole story, but the Green New Deal becoming the Inflation Reduction Act is an illustration of the way that minority checks work. If you're opposed to change, you just have to block that change somewhere in the system in order to get the changes to those bills that you want or prevent it from passing altogether.
I think it's helpful to use concrete examples for how those minoritarian checks, as you described them, either just outright block something or distort something beyond all recognition, and that at least has to be acknowledged, I think, by folks who would advocate for these large transformative measures, if you will, to at least say, look, we live in a particular system in which that's a very tall, if not impossible ask. So I think it's really important to bring in the New Deal in that way, Green New Deal. Mhm. Something that you're very involved in is union work, and I actually find your kind of combination of constitutional discussion and union discussion sort of unique. I think if it usually seems to me as if folks tend to either live in kind of one of those two worlds, if you will, and that often the Constitution question isn't integrated into a lot of union questions, a lot of union discussions. So you argue that not just folks in unions, many intellectuals, unions, and left movements throughout history have often dismissed the Constitution as unimportant for one reason or another, and that's been done to their detriment. And I saw a connection there, and I think you make that connection explicit between then how people are often content with rather vague descriptions of power. And so you give an example of the phrase, when we fight, we win, basically as saying, well, that's when is that the case? when do we win? What does it mean to win? Um, and yet these slogans, if you will, that I think often gloss over how power works, how the political system works, are rather prevalent. So I was curious why you think the Constitution has been dismissed, why the Constitution as a mechanism of power often isn't discussed, and then why the Constitution matters.
Well, thank you for appreciating my combination of the two. And the combination is really intentional. And when I was talking about my political trajectory from being interested and participating in electoralism and then in NGO advocacy, I had also been attempting to create new rank and file unions. And I didn't really know what I was doing when I was in graduate school, but I tried to learn as I was doing. And I've come back to it because I've realized that in our system of representative democracy, that without a theory of power and without actual power and power that can apply leverage so that it becomes disruptive and forces economic elites to pay attention to movements, nothing can be accomplished. And it's kind of like a coming full circle. And I realized that electoralism, advocacy, mobilizing, all of those are really central to what we call social movements. But social movements don't succeed without a theory of power and without the ability to use power to disrupt the system in order to extract changes that allows those who run our economic and political systems to get them going again. And I've come to the conclusion that the only real source of power is in a capitalist system is in our labor. Our ability to withhold our work, to withhold our labor, is the most important power that we have. And yet, ironically, in the last 50 something years, as NGOs have risen, funded by foundations for the most part, that are financed by the wealthy super elite, which is the subject of my next book, NGOs have displaced labor unions. as the primary source of social change. And and here I'm not just talking about labor unions, I'm talking about the ability of workers to self-organize. Whenever workers organize, they are a union. You don't have to have leadership and bylaws and dues and so forth to form a union. Any two workers talking about their job and acting on issues at work are a union. And I came to the conclusion that the real most effective source of power that we have is to disrupt our capitalist economy. The state, in some ways, as Marx and Engels put it in the Communist Manifesto, is the committee for administering the capitalist economy. And our greatest power lies there. And so when we use this kind of chant at my union, the California Faculty Association, which includes faculty, tenured and non-tenured like myself, coaches, librarians, and counselors, when we use this slogan, as many other unions do, that when we fight, we win, it's missing a theory of power. Fighting in itself doesn't mean you win. And win what? So it leaves a lot of questions to be explored, to be discussed. And so I think that I combine a theory of class struggle with an understanding of our plutocratic representative democracy, because our system was designed in the first place as a system of class power. And this is what I take the readers through in We the Elites, is to show how essentially the 53 white men who wrote the Constitution and then advocated for its ratification were among the richest in the country. And while they had many differences, some were merchants and bankers, and some were slave owners and planters and financiers and traders, at the Constitutional Convention, it took them a few months to overcome their differences. But at the convention, they came together and formed a unified class vision of the way that they would govern the country. And they used that to get rid of the Articles of Confederation. And so we have to look at the Constitution as really a class document, as a system of rule that reinforces our system of property. And it's no accident that there's actually dozens of ways in the Articles alone that property is protected, but there's virtually no rights in the original Articles. And other than habeas corpus, and if you meet the requirements, you have the right to run for office and serve. You can serve in a criminal jury, but not yet a civil jury. The rights that start getting added to the Constitution happen after the concessions are made, because during the ratification process, the so-called anti-federalists were able to mobilize and defeat ratification in a few states. So when we look at our Constitution, we have to see it as a system by which our capitalist economy is protected and that class power is reproduced. And anything short of having a class analysis for how we make change won't get us to the urgently needed change that we need right now as our planet catches fire and is engulfed in rising ocean levels and horrific tornadoes and wildfires and all the other effects of catastrophic climate catastrophe.
Yeah, I appreciate the analysis of power. I think that's very important. The question of where does power come from? How can you get power? And not being content with generalizations, phrases that might make for a nice march lead, but that don't actually apply specifics to sort of understand the particular system that we live in.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on to that, some of the problem where we can trace that back is on the left. And I talk about some historians and political analysts on the left who, for decades, have said really that our constitutional system doesn't matter. If we just organize enough people and create a big enough fuss, will get reforms. And, I have to say, I love his work. It inspired me. Um, and I've used it in my teaching. But Howard Zinn essentially is probably the most prominent voice who essentially said the Constitution doesn't really matter if you have enough people in the streets. And that's not really how change happens in our system, because ultimately, even if you do get those reforms, like I was talking about earlier, the minority checks of those in the numerical minority, and I should have clarified that when I say minority, I don't mean minority in a racial or gender sense today, but I mean minority in numerical minority. And the economic elites are always in the numerical minority. And so, if you have a social movement that achieves some reform, ultimately that reform gets whittled down and sometimes even turned into just complete opposite. And so, if we don't understand how changes get chewed up and regurgitated in ways that work against us because of the design of our constitutional system, we're going to keep running on the treadmill. We're never going to get the change that we fundamentally need. And and I like to point to the 13th Amendment as that. You had hundreds of thousands of slaves and whites fighting together to overthrow slavery. And what do we get? The 13th Amendment, which allows prisoners to be treated as slaves. And in the process of getting that 13th Amendment through the Democratic-controlled Congress, because the Southern states had left, the Republican-controlled Congress, because the Democrats in the Southern states had left, the 13th Amendment has this huge gaping loophole that allows slavery to continue. And there are numerous other examples of that.
Yeah, the Howard Zinn example is interesting. I feel the same way. Howard Zinn really transformed my politics when I encountered him for the first time. And yet he was very clear that, yeah, the Constitution really doesn't matter that much. And that sentiment that the Constitution doesn't matter, I feel like it has a presence on, I don't know what you would call maybe the more liberal left, in the sense of, I don't know if we just kind of elect the right person, or yeah, just kind of protest hard enough, that will kind of get the goods. But I think it can also have a presence on a farther left section, if you will, that would just sort of dismiss anything political as superstructural, anything to do with the law as superstructural.
Mhm.
And at the same time, then basically take that same stance of, well, it just doesn't matter. Why talk about this stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, right. That it becomes kind of deterministic.
Mhm.
Overthrow capitalism and we'll change the political system. Good luck with that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair response. um, One of the things that stood out to me about your book that I didn't take away the first time I read it, was the folks who are who have written praise for your book on the inside cover. Many books have endorsements from folks, and you've got some great folks endorsing your book. So of these names, and I'll list a few. Some of them, like Daniel Lazaire and also Sanford Levinson, they praise your book, and they're also well known for their constitutional critiques. That's sort of their realm. There are other folks who also have positive things to say about your book: Gerald Horne, Richard Wolff, Noam Chomsky, Olufemi Otaiwo. Those folks are known for a lot of things, but the Constitution and critiquing the Constitution isn't one of them. So
Mhm.
I'm curious why you think some people, uh, like Lazaire, Levinson, and I include you, notice the Constitution and pursue it. Pursue it as in writing a book, talking about it, so on and so forth. And why other people notice the Constitution, Noam Chomsky, Gerald Horne, Richard Wolff, they all know what's going on and they're all aware of your book and so on and so forth. But they don't pursue the Constitution. What you kind of think is going on there?
Well, in a way, I would actually say Gerald Horne is dealing with a lot of the issues of racial domination and white supremacy that are built into the Constitution. While he doesn't go at it directly, he is dealing. His life's work is dealing with the implications of our constitutional system. Whereas Olufemi is dealing with how change happens and how it gets turned into its complete opposite, like I was just talking about. And I think Richard Wolff, it is dealing with the class element of how change happens in our system. And he does focus in on some of the micro aspects of policy changes in our system, and then ties it back to the fact that we have a capitalist economy, and here's what's needed to challenge that. But I think overall, you're right that they don't come out directly about the Constitution. And I think there's several reasons for that. I think we often tend, and yeah, we're all academics on that list except maybe Daniel. We all tend to kind of stay in our own on our own side of the street, if you will. We tend to specialize, and we focus on that for a reason, because we know that subject matter, inside and out. And I don't know what their personal reasons for not tying it more explicitly to the Constitution is, but when you put all of their work together, the totality of it is what, and many of them have influenced me tremendously for years. The totality of their work helps us understand how the things that you and I are talking about right now, why they're so important. Um, so, and I think that's one element of it, that we tend to specialize. Another element of it is the Constitution is just really damn complex. And if you're not somebody like Sanford Levinson, teaching law, um, it may not be something that you feel that inside and out enough. And I'm really at the bottom of the food chain, like I was saying at the beginning. I teach about 500 undergraduates introductory level courses to our constitutional system every year. I'm no means am I teaching more advanced classes, let alone at the graduate level. And so I think that the complexity of our constitutional system. I mean, if you're researching an individual court case, you're looking at a huge amount of literature on that. So it can be incredibly complex and daunting, I think, to take on the Constitution. And it's really been an accumulated decade and a half of my own research and thinking and teaching about the Constitution that led me to be able to write this book, which is only about 200 pages long. So I don't know if that's a sufficient answer, but I think there's personal reasons, but there's also, the Constitution is a complex document with 230 something years of precedent and legal histories and a countless number of books about it that you really have to pore through, as well as the writings of the framers, and in order to feel that you can master this subject enough to write a book about it.
Well, it's a great point that while the Constitution might not be explicitly mentioned in much of their work, there are aspects. so the Constitution, as sort of the political structure, if you will, is tied into so much, and then also thinking about how the totality of that work influences the folks who do then go on to talk more explicitly about the Constitution. And looking at that list, I think I looked at it. I thought, oh, great praise, excellent book. And then only a little while later did I think, but you know what? I never thought of Noam Chomsky as someone to talk about the Constitution, or so just that sort of kind of incongruity, if you will. I thought was sort of interesting.
And just one other thing about this is that I think this is one of the flaws on the left for the last, I would say, half century, is that in the 1960s, there was a lot of active analysis of the Constitution. And in the 1930s, there were a number of prominent scholars who wrote explicitly about our plutocratic system from the perspective of the Constitution. And then also from in the first 2 decades during the progressive, populist, and socialist era, there were a number of prominent scholars who wrote about it. There were prominent magazines on the left that focused on the Constitution itself as the problem. And we've lost that tradition. And because we tend to focus on the consequences rather than the causes. And so, Noam Chomsky, has done his lifetime of work is beyond repute, right? But he's mostly writing about the effects of plutocracy, right? That's been his work. And he shows how our plutocratic system functions on a day-to-day level. But you're right. He doesn't go to the Constitution and say, this is the details of why we have a plutocracy in our political sphere.
That's such a great point that constitutional critique has had a place on the left in the past, but hasn't had one in a while. So it's not a foreign thing to talk about these things, but it can seem like that to one who maybe hasn't gone further back. It's lost history. It's a lost tradition, lost engagement. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I wanted to bring in something that I read in Jacobin magazine about a month ago, and see what you think about it, because reading this quote, and I'll read the quote in a sec, it made me think a little bit about how I encounter discussions of the law, constitutions, in a more, if you will, labor union dominated space. But I'll pause there. So this is from an article that, an interview that Vivek Chibber did in Jacobin, and it's a little bit of a long quote here. Chibber says that a struggle for socialism or even social democracy calls on people to take enormous risks and make enormous sacrifices because they will have to take on the capitalist class. And he continues, I do not see any way that moral advocacy can be the mechanism for bringing most people to such a political project. You need to be able to show people that they have a real interest in the outcome, a material interest, and not just a moral calling. And you also have to show them that it's realistic, the struggle. The struggle is realistic, that it's not just a kind of suicide mission. So I feel like I encounter this argument in different ways on the left, basically saying material interests trump morality, and that also people won't really act unless something is realistic. And then how that incorporates the Constitution is to say, well, how does the Constitution impact people's material interests so they're not interested? And then how the heck is it realistic? It's not tangible. The Constitution isn't something I can grab a hold of, if you will. What is tangible, I don't know. But anyways, curious what you think of that.
Yeah, I've had to reread that passage several times to really get at what Chibber's trying to say. And I think there's a lot of truth with quotes around it to it, but there's also a lot of threats of a dead end. I'll speak to the truth first. When the left is trying to speak about issues that are important, that deserve and demand immediate attention and transformative change to bring about changes, we have this tendency to adopt what I call NGOization approaches to social change. Just the term social change, social movements, these are manufactured and constructed by foundation-funded theorists in the first place. And I just want to speak to the etymology of these terms. But since the 1990s, there's been this almost fear of talking about material interests. In other words, what I don't even like to use the term materialist. I prefer to just say the failure to use a class analysis. both because it's a willing failure and also because, well, some people just don't have a class analysis. And the idea is that instead we should talk about material interest as a story. And you can trace this back to these foundation funded folks on the anti-globalization left, if you will, who trained a lot of organizers and activists to talk about the story rather than the interests. And in a way, that was a designed strategy of defeat. We are so enamored by the idea that we live in a society that only understands stories, that we have transposed what are real concrete struggles between classes into, and I think what Chibber might be saying here is we've transformed them into moralistic tales. Instead of talking about capitalism, we talk about the super elite or the super rich. And we talk about the 99% instead of capitalists and workers. Unions talk about the middle class, ironically, without ever using the word worker or working class. You can see it in speeches of, for example, those who claim to be socialists in Congress who never use the word worker or working class and talk about the building the middle class. And I think this might be what he's getting at, is we can't keep trying to recruit people by appealing to morality and telling them stories about good guys and bad guys or good people and bad people. We need to address real concrete clashes of interests. And I think that's how I read this. And I didn't read the full essay, so I'm going based on this quote. On the other hand, I think there's also a kind of strategy of defeat by making this contrast. I think instead what we need to do is not speak about ideology, which is what I think he's getting at. Vivek is he, I think. But rather we need to frame issues so that it's very clear that there's a class analysis behind the issue. We don't have to talk about capitalists and workers explicitly to people who don't know really what that means. But we can talk about interests in a way that makes it very clear that there's two sets of interests, and those interests are engaged in a struggle for power. And I'll just give you an example. As a contingent, non-tenured professor, a lecturer formally, my union will often trade away in bargaining a small pay increase, which is really crumbs, in exchange for allowing the California State University system to control our class sizes. And what many of us have been saying for years is, if you give away a 10% pay increase over 3 years and they increase our class sizes by 20%, that's actually a 10% pay cut. Right? So if you speak about issues in a very clear way, that there's us doing the work and there's folks on the other side who are the managers who are trying to extract more and more of our labor, everybody gets it. Even if they call themselves Trumpites or they vote for Harris or Stein or Cornel West, it doesn't really matter. If you frame the issues in such a way that people can identify and see their own interests in it, you don't have to talk about morality, and you don't even have to be explicit about your own ideology. And you can still organize people around that. And so that's my sense of that passage and that idea.
I wanted to turn for our last two questions to the conclusion of your book, and then also kind of has happened since your book came out. So Lucas and I, broadly speaking, I think take essentially everything that you put forward in the preceding chapters of your book, which includes the Constitution's history, its minoritarian design with the various checks that you talked about, the fact that only a few Americans, and obviously no one living today, had a say in the Constitution's creation, and basically conclude that we need an actually democratic constitution. Um, and I'd also agree this process can't really be constitutional, if you will, because it wouldn't be able to go through Article 5. It would be a revolutionary movement for a new democratic constitution. And that then through that democratic system, there could be transformations of the economy and the workplace and so on and so forth. Um, and your conclusion in the book is titled "Beyond the Constitution," which, if I understand it correctly, is arguing that we really can't replace the Constitution. We shouldn't replace the Constitution. We should really think beyond constitutions in general. Um, and you say at one point that representative democracy is really a historically specific governance system for capitalism that must be transcended. So, one, just wanted to open up the conclusion of your book for you to talk about, but also curious what a society without a constitution would look like. Would it be one without a written constitution? Maybe something closer to the United Kingdom. Would it have an unwritten? Would there be an unwritten constitution? How would decisions be made? So on and so forth.
Well, right now we do face an ongoing effort that's slowly gaining momentum to call for a constitutional convention using Article 5, but it's not one that we want. And when I say we, I mean, people who see that there's a need for a deep systemic transformation of our system of governance and our economic system. And that's because it's being financed by the remaining Koch brother, the KOCH, multi-billionaires who were making their money from deforestation and coal mining in Kansas. And if they succeed, they will likely call a constitutional convention that will make things even worse. And it's going to be an uphill battle for them, but they have the funding for it. And they are slowly getting states to pass resolutions calling for a convention, which has never been done this way before because we've never had a convention called. So that is both deadly, but it's also a dead end for anyone who wants to do it from the ground up. And it's a dead end because the threshold is so high. You need 2/3 of Congress or 2/3 of the states, and then you need 3/4 to ratify. And in my book, I talk about how few states you need. You need a few percent of the U.S. population represented in the Senate to block that from happening, from it ever passing the Senate. And so the threshold was set that high on purpose. It was yet another minority check. In fact, Article 5 has something in it that a lot of people don't realize is in there. And it actually protects the Senate from ever being changed to get rid of it, for example. The last clause says, "And that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate." So the framers knew the Senate was going to be unpopular because this appearance of equality is actually inequality. Large states get 2 senators, so each vote in each resident of that state counts for less in the Senate than in a small state that has 2 senators. So it's dead end, and we can only hope that the Koch effort doesn't succeed. So that possibility, there, and a lot of folks don't realize that we have 27 amendments, but more than half of them were actually ratified by the end of the Reconstruction era, which ended in 1877. And there hasn't been one for decades that's been added to the Constitution out of more than 10,000 that have been officially introduced. So it's a tiny, tiny fraction of 1%. So the success rate is not very high. It's a losing cause to actually try to do that. But then again, we should be questioning: do we need a constitution to govern ourselves? As you pointed out, the UK doesn't have a written constitution. Israel, of all places, does not have a written constitution. Internationally, we have a body of international law that really is a constitution. It's just not written down as a constitution, just like the UK and Israel and a few other countries that don't have a single written constitution. The UK, for example, has an unwritten constitution that's a compendium of laws passed by Parliament, court rulings, precedent, customs, common law, as well as various rulings from international bodies that are recognized as enforceable in the UK. So it's not entirely true that those countries don't have a constitution. They just don't have a single source for a constitution. So I really question the idea that we need a constitution, because constitutions are a way of codifying protections for property, of codifying exclusive power to make decisions over how property is acquired and protected by the capitalist class. And so constitutions are very specific to the kind of economic system that we have. Pre-capitalist societies didn't need to write it all down, because either if they were hunters and gatherers, they used customs. If they were feudalistic, there's no need for a written constitution, because whatever one person says, the king or monarch, queen, is the law. So there's no reason to write it down, right? So constitutions are very specific to our own capitalist economic system. So if our objective is to transcend capitalism, then we don't need a system of rules. What we need to do is focus on organizing ourselves to meet our immediate needs. And we do that by controlling the production of essential goods and services and democratizing that process, and working with those producing particular goods and relying on them to make decisions collectively. So borrowing from syndicalism, we can transition out of the current system that we have by workers taking over and democratizing the workplace and working with local communities to decide what goods and services are produced, how they're produced, who gets the benefit from them. And then I draw on the ideas of the anarchist philosopher Murray Bookchin, who sadly, towards the end of his life, became more of an electoralist. But he developed this idea of localism based on confederations, where local communities self-organize and they organize themselves into regional and even global networks with other confederations, who then make decisions directly about how they govern themselves and how they support one another. So we self-organize and we interconnect through systems of solidarity and mutual obligations. I've been reading, since my daughter started reading this book in the university in the last few weeks, I picked it up again. And it's called Stone Age Economics by Marshall Salins. And it's a difficult book to read, but one of the things that comes across is that hunters and gatherers have a complex system of reciprocity. And I think essentially what Bookchin's idea is based on reciprocity. And in fact, this is an idea where, the last few chapters of my book is just a little hint of what I plan to come back to. And in fact, I'm currently trying to find a publisher for 2 books from now, which I'm calling America 2.0, where I plan on laying out how we transition past capitalism and past our plutocratic representative democracy in order to stop the destruction of all life on the surface of this planet and move past capitalism. And so it's going to be a very prescriptive kind of, I would even say, utopian strategic roadmap. How do we get past these two systems before it's too late? So those last 2 chapters in the book are just really kind of like a little teaser, a little hint.
Gotcha. Well, I think sometimes prescriptions and detailed ideas can be helpful in that, at least in my case, they force me to think, well, I do agree with that, or I don't agree with that. Why don't I agree with that? So on and so forth.
Right.
So I'll look forward to those.
Great. Hope I can find a publisher.
That's true. That's true. Yes. I wanted to catch us up more or less to the present moment with this last question. It hasn't been all that long since we, the elite, came out. And yet it feels like a lot has happened around Constitution talk just within the past year and a half, if you will. So, for example, Daniel Lazaire continuing to write, um, and there are also newer folks who have joined the discussion around the Constitution more explicitly. Aziz Rana, the Constitutional Bind, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt wrote The Tyranny of the Minority. Erwin Chemerinsky, the dean of UC Berkeley Law, wrote No Democracy Lasts Forever. David Dayen, the editor of the American Prospect, wrote an article called America's Not a Democracy. And then various things have been put forward in the Times. And then most recently, Jonathan Turley wrote in the Wall Street Journal, not happily, about what he calls a growing counter-constitutional movement that began in higher education and seems recently to have reached a critical mass in the media and politics. So, curious what you think is going on here. Why, assuming I'm correct, why are people talking about democracy, the Constitution, not yet, if you will, in broad society, perhaps more in higher ed and in the media. But what's going on here?
Well, I would also add the New York Times columnist who has written extensively about the Constitution as well, whose name I'm unfortunately forgetting right now.
Might
So
be Jamel Bowie, but
yes, Jamel Bowie. Thank you.
okay,
Yes,
you're right.
fantastic,
We could include everyone.
fantastic pieces. And Daniel Czar, I follow in his footsteps. Daniel, I communicated with Daniel when I started writing this book, and his pieces were incredibly formative and inspiring to me. And I think I come closest to Daniel in terms of how I see the Constitution as a class document for governance. I don't see the same thing with these other folks, and certainly not David Dayen. And there's a fundamental reason why, and that is that while they're correct in a narrow sense that our system is not democratic, that minorities have exaggerated influence, which is Zibot's and Levitsky's argument. There's also another book about abolish the Senate. I'm forgetting also the author of that one that came out in the last few years. And when I have to say I haven't read some of these books, but I've read excerpts, I've heard interviews with them, and the one thing that just keeps me from being impressed is that they don't see the connection, they don't see the political economy of our Constitution. Only really Daniel does. Sanford Levinson to a limited degree, but he hasn't written anything lately on this. But these folks just don't see, they ignore capitalism. And without an analysis of capitalism, you can't really explain, for example, the Senate, the appearance of equality in the Senate, or the high threshold to amend the Constitution, or the 3/5 clause. How do you explain all of those supposed flaws? And they're not flaws. They are intentional tactics to prevent the existing relations of property, which at the time the Constitution was written were primarily the enslavement of human beings, and they're exploiting their labor and the land that the labor was exploited on, and the financial assets that we didn't even talk about that needed to be repaid in order to get the financial system up and running and the capitalist economy to have a source of investment capital, which was the project that Hamilton took on, which is another important sub-theme in my book. So these other authors, they don't get the job done. And while it's impressive that more and more people are paying attention to it, unfortunately, they have their short-term fixes that won't fundamentally change the fact that the Constitution is the rule book for protecting property. And so I think I don't think we're at the same level of the Charles Beard's work in the 1930s that we talked about earlier, or the various members of the Socialist Party in the teens who were writing entire books about this very question of our system of representative democracy and capitalism. So we're in a different place, and I'm not yet sure that that our critique has been elevated to the necessary level of understanding of the political economy of our system.
I appreciate you diving in and trying to draw out differences and really analyzing the situation. Yeah. Well, Robert, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us. I'm also going to link in the show notes the interview that Donald and I did with you closer to the time your book actually came out, but that was such a long time ago. Well, not such a long time ago; it was a little while ago. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Great conversation to have, and I hope you continue it. And your podcast is very necessary, and so we need to have this conversation. So thank you for all the work you're doing.
Thank you.